As 2311 and Front Row Motorsports launched their legal battle against NASCAR itself for more control and earnings, the league's tight grasp of power begins to come into view. It's important to understand the challenges NASCAR has faced against its leadership over the years and what we might expect to see as an outcome for the pending litigation. The France family holds control over a major sports and entertainment company that is not often seen in other enterprises of this level. This makes the France family so intriguing. All other major sports in the United States may have begun with the idea of a singular person in control, but none have maintained that control in a fashion that is often done in the way of a small business. The France family's dominance of NASCAR is unprecedented in the history of American sport. While most families earn millions in other businesses and then move into ownership roles in professional sports, Bill France Sr. arrived in Daytona Beach in 1935, virtually penniless, and turned his interest in stock car racing into an enterprise worth billions of dollars. As the investors in a major sport invest in the league, they normally expect a certain amount of control for that investment. Front Row Motorsports and Jordan's 2311 Racing have sued NASCAR and its chief executive officer, Jim France, accusing them of violating U.S. antitrust laws by imposing restrictive conditions on teams to curb competition from other racing organizations, that NASCAR unwillingly monopolized the market for premier stock car racing, allowing it to keep a greater share of the profits. Jordan founded 2311 Racing in 2020 with longtime driver Denny Hamlin and Curtis Polk, one of his business associates. Bob Jenkins owns Front Row Motorsports, which has been racing since 2005. The teams say NASCAR is abusing its power to impose one-sided economic terms that were far less than the teams could have obtained in a competitive market, to which NASCAR countered that the plaintiffs were unfairly trying to use the courts to force the league into a contract. Unlike with football, baseball, and basketball, where team owners collectively control the sanctioning body and thus their sport, the France family has ran NASCAR as a benevolent dictatorship, maintaining sole control of its finances, rules, and participants. No drivers' unions existed, nor did car owners have formal representation. My way or the highway was the phrase used to describe the management style of Big Bill and Bill Jr. This structure sets NASCAR apart from other major sports. Longtime competitor Smokey Yunick said it best when he said, "NASCAR is the Frances." Bill Sr. understood that maintaining control meant that he must have plans in place that allowed him to completely be self-sufficient. As a promoter and sanctioning body, France was able to oversee control of what happened in the races, but with ownership in Daytona and later tracks, he was able to control every aspect. Because the France family owned the track, they were able to have even more control over what happened in the sport. This led to a leadership monopoly in which the France family has the most control over a sport than any one single family in America. This power resulted in the Frances not only establishing ownership as the controlling body, but over the sports venues themselves in most cases. The renowned antitrust lawyer for 2311 and Front Row Motorsports stated, "What we are arguing here is that NASCAR is a monopoly. No surprise to NASCAR fans. There is no alternative to NASCAR, not just in this country, but frankly around the world. And it got its monopoly illegally. The main reason it got it illegally is because it tied up all of the racetracks in the country, because it doesn't let any other teams compete for any other racing circuit." Bill Sr. was willing at times to hear the advice of those he felt he could trust, but ultimately the final say aligned with his desires and ideas. There had never been a doubt that the France family was fully in charge from the beginning of the sport. The drivers were independent contractors and not employed by NASCAR. Bill Sr. made threats of closing tracks, banning drivers, and even brandished a pistol to enforce his official stance on the topics. Car owner and crew chief Smokey Yunick wrote that the dictatorial leadership worked in part because those that took part in the sport were unable or unwilling to be led by any other method. The buzzwords are, "NASCAR was run by a dictatorship," he said, "and that's why it worked, possibly. How are you going to prove otherwise? I've been around quite a bit of this world and many of its life's problems. My experiences led me to conclude that we were an ignorant bunch of lower-class society, all right, because the only place a dictatorship works is when the subjects are uneducated. And if they have a wise and fair dictator, he manages their lives for them. France never had a respect or a cooperation. If you questioned a stupid call by the chief inspector and asked why, the standard answer one of the ignorant assholes France had for chief inspectors was, "Because I said so." All-time race win leader Richard Petty is quoted as saying, "In the long run, when you look back, Everybody knows that things had to be done that way to keep NASCAR operating smoothly. Many of those familiar with early days of NASCAR saw no separation between the man and the organization. Bill France was NASCAR. As many critics claim that France negatively impacted the racing business by lowering standards of those established by other governing bodies. The AAA and USAC had always paid 40% of their gate out as the purse. Bill Sr. had never met this same standard. Former driver Marshall Teague, acting as NASCAR's first secretary and treasurer, tried to get Bill Sr. to meet this standard, but found himself suspended and relieved of his office position. As tensions built over the years, drivers and owners would attempt to gain more control before this latest test. In the early 1960s, as drivers wanted more rewards for their risk, they discussed the idea of forming a union. One of the leaders of the movement was Hall of Fame driver Curtis Turner. Turner ran into a fierce opposition of Bill France, who declared he would never allow union activity in NASCAR and use a pistol to enforce it. When France's authority was challenged, he was willing to go to any means necessary to retain power. A man with imagination and nerve, Turner contacted the Teamsters Union and proposed a deal. The Teamsters would loan him $800,000, and he would unionize the drivers and work to allow betting on the races. Turner was desperate, and he was making a deal with the devil. Once Turner made the union public, France immediately flew into Winston-Salem to confront all drivers before the start of the 1961 Bowman Gray race. In an hour-long meeting, France told drivers, "Gentlemen, I won't be dictated by a union." He swore he would shut down all tracks and tear them down. He told drivers that anyone joining the union would not be allowed in NASCAR and supported it by saying, "And if this isn't tough enough, I'll use a pistol to enforce it. I have a pistol, and I know how to use it. I've used it before." France defended these actions by saying that banning the union was a safety measure. Reigning 1960 Cup champion Rex White refused to join the union. White understood that many of the drivers had legitimate complaints and wanted a larger cut of the ticket sales, but he also claimed that the board appointed by France could sufficiently decide what was the best for NASCAR, the owners, and the drivers. Although White was intrigued by the idea of a retirement plan that the union would offer, he still decided the ramifications from France win out in the end. If the drivers joined together and held outside support, the dictatorial grip would be weakened or even lost. Fireball Roberts stated, "We must have grabbed Mr. France where it hurts," from all the things that he said in the papers. With Fireball Roberts choosing to remain with NASCAR, Curtis Turner and Tim Flock stood alone against France. France banned both NASCAR racers for life, again, wielding his unlimited power of leadership. But a few years later, in 1965, NASCAR experienced low attendance problems due to Chrysler forfeiting over a decision by Bill Sr., and in a ploy to draw fans back, France reinstated Turner, rescinding his lifetime ban to reports, "We feel Curtis Turner has paid the penalty for his actions by sitting out 4 years from NASCAR racing." Bill Sr. wanted to ensure that the drivers of whom people became fans were only available to be seen racing while in NASCAR races. Bill Sr.'s dictatorial leadership style surfaced here like never before. In addition to the safety challenges drivers faced, they chafed at the increasingly dictatorial actions of Bill France, whose power over the drivers only increased with the growing popularity of NASCAR and the elimination of most of its viable rivals. France primarily used his power, especially his ability to fine, take championship points away, suspend, or ban drivers for actions detrimental to stock car racing, an attempt to prevent drivers from racing with other competing series. Lee Petty lost the 1950 points championship after he drove in a so-called outlaw event. Other drivers quit racing completely in disgust with how Bill Sr. was running NASCAR. Drivers knew that Bill Sr. held all the power, and more so than that, Bill Sr. knew that he held all the power and control. Few drivers had not experienced some sort of penalty from NASCAR, with the catch-all changes of actions detrimental to auto racing frequently coming into play to cover any penalty NASCAR and France wanted to assess. When drivers and owners were asking for a larger cut, which was 40% of the profits, France refused to negotiate. He felt the drivers were being disloyal to the great thing that he had built for them. Rather than diplomacy, France chose to use force. Bill sent a telegram informing personnel, "Drivers who fail to race exclusively for NASCAR will be barred." When it came time for the first race at the new Talladega track in 1969, problems arose again. The speeds were so fast that drivers were not sure that the tires would hold up. At this time, drivers had semi-organized a drivers' union for the second time, this time called the Professional Drivers Association, with fan favorite Richard Petty in the leadership role. The drivers saw this as an opportunity to test their new unification. France took this just as he had the first time union talk surfaced. Jim Hunter recalls, "When faced with the possibility of the PDA boycott, He told the drivers to basically not let the track gate hit them in the ass on their way out. It would be his way or no way. Driver Bobby Allison said, Bill Sr. knew we had to go racing, and we knew we had to go racing. We knew we didn't want to go out and get newspaper routes or gas station jobs. That's for sure. Charlotte News reporter Bob Myers states, France retaliated by loading the field with drivers from his Grand Touring division, now what would be called the Xfinity Series. He thought the organization was a threat to NASCAR. He despised threats to his organization worse than anything he'd ever seen. He just wouldn't tolerate it. The drivers were afraid to say anything about the way that they had been treated, feared that they would be retribution. There were highlights of the breach of safety protocol when NASCAR proceeded with the Sportsman Division race in Daytona in 1969, even though there was clearly a wet track. Driver Don McTavish was killed in an accident that took place due to poor racing conditions. I don't know how those NASCAR officials can sleep at night, others were quoted as saying. The first race of the new Talladega Motor Speedway in 1969 was one of the biggest challenges for leadership of NASCAR in its history. Bill Sr. was still at the head of the leadership position, but Bill Jr. was being groomed for his future leadership role. As the drivers threatened to leave, the Frances had to act quickly. Jim France spoke of his brother's involvement in that first Talladega situation. There was a lot of political stuff going on in the background with the PDA. It was complex, and Talladega was the point where people decided to bring it to a head. I think that my brother took away from that experience was that he reached out and started getting a better working relationship with the drivers and the teams. That way, going forward, if issues came up, he would work with them. I think Richard Petty and a bunch of the guys came to have a comfort level with Bill Jr. that they didn't feel with my dad. Bill Jr. was able to really listen to the teams and drivers and then come back later with situations that worked for everyone. Bill Jr. was able to really create good lines of communication with the teams and drivers that really helped advance the sport. Bill learned from the first Talladega race that there was a better way of solving problems. I think we proactively worked to get involved with people. He listened to what people had to say. Now, those same people might not always agree with the decisions he made, but people came to respect him because he would take in everybody's input and make decisions that were ultimately good for the sport and good for everybody who was trying to make a living in the industry. In the 1971 season, the auto industry met and agreed to once again withdraw support from NASCAR. They all felt, even from the outside view, that France had too great a grip on the sport as a whole, which hindered them from featuring their products as they wished. In 1972, Bill Sr. handed control of NASCAR to his oldest son, Bill France Jr. The change of leadership was met with mixed reactions. This event coincided with beginning what is known as the modern era within NASCAR history. Bill Jr. brought NASCAR to the attention of the rest of the world under his leadership, attracting some of the world's most powerful and profitable companies to become involved. He focused storylines and made decisions that guided the sport to a peak where tracks proliferated across North America as special races were being held as far away as Japan. Bill Jr. saw the things that made his father successful and incorporated them into his own management style. Bill France Jr. would use some of his father's tactics for running the sport based on personal relationships and with drivers and crewmen. Bill Jr. considered the input of a variety of sources and people he trusted. This did not change the fact that he still had a no-holds-barred attitude when he had made up his mind. There was always a view from those taking part in the sport that NASCAR moved too slowly. That was done by design. Bill Jr. wanted to take the time to think everything through. Though he was willing to consider other perspectives, Bill Jr. still was a stern leader. The drivers knew that Bill Jr. would have the last word, but they felt that he was at least willing to hear them in a way that Sr. had not been. He knew he was in charge, and he used that perception to his advantage. Some leaders are fully in charge without a system of checks and balances. Team owner Rick Hendrick saw the commanding style that Jr. played as his signature approach. Hendrick said that he learned early on that Bill Jr. was the best in a one-on-one discussion. If an individual challenged him in front of others, Bill Jr. felt the need to assert his dominance and defend NASCAR no matter what. At the same time, he would trash your ass in front of people. Bill Senders of the San Diego Union Tribune stated, "For a dictator, he was a pretty good guy. Even those that took part in NASCAR more after his leadership were able to see the effects that the ideas and guidance had on the sport." Dale Earnhardt Jr. saw Bill Jr.'s leadership as a high point for the sport. "I always thought it was better when Bill Jr. was at the top, going, 'Here's what we're going to do. Everybody fall in line.'" Like many autocratic leaders, Bill Jr. had a hard time fully letting go of control. In 2003, Brian was making presentations that were unofficial state of the sport. In the middle of Brian's sentence, Bill Jr. arose from his seat and called for a microphone and said, "Brian, let me help you out." Bill Jr. then began what turned into a lecture on a concept called Realignment 2004 and beyond. He laid out a plan that was hazy but with points. He also stated this was to serve as an across-the-board warning to all tracks involved in the NASCAR Sprint Cup Series that race dates are subject to change based on how NASCAR saw fit. But Bill Jr. also made a statement directed to the various track ownership groups, dispelling the myth that NASCAR uses an autocratic approach and would adjust the schedule without any input. We are not going to take ISC races and give them to SMI tracks, or vice versa, he said. Brian was determined from the start to make his own mark in the family business and establish leadership just as his father and grandfather had achieved. He called for major rule changes that resulted in the season racing to unfold in a more competitive form, with an elimination-style playoff much like that of college basketball. Broadcast ratings increased, and the new multi-billion-dollar deal was reached with television networks. Sadly, an economic downturn and better coverage on television and connected devices forced a sharp decline in the attendance numbers. Critics were quick to blame Brian France's leadership style and decision-making process for the decline in attendance. As once before in NASCAR's history, the drivers and owners sought to organize in order to claim more power for themselves under Brian's leadership. The Race Team Alliance, or RTA, was founded in 2014 with the goal of increasing revenues and budget efficiency for the teams. Brian France did not like the idea of a union forming, quoted as saying, "We didn't think it was necessary," France said of the formation of the RTA during an interview with SiriusXM NASCAR Radio. "We think the benefits they will arrive at with this association will be much smaller than they do." However, Brian did not meet the teams and drivers with a pistol in hand as his grandfather once did. His strategy was to let the organization exist, taking input into consideration. With pressure from owners and drivers, in 2016, NASCAR introduced charters to reward teams that showed consistent participation in races. To decide on these charters, they evaluated team engagement and performance over the previous 3 years, ultimately granting 36 charters to the teams that had met their criteria for commitment. As a result, for races that featured 40-car field, there are now 4 available spots for teams that do not hold charters. As Bill France Jr. and Brian France were each at the helm of NASCAR's empire, Jim France, Bill's younger brother, worked with NASCAR as a board member. Additionally, he ran its sports car division holdings and served in major roles within the sister company, International Speedway Corporation, that has now been merged with NASCAR itself. Current NASCAR president Steve Phelps spoke about the continued leadership style the France family has utilized throughout NASCAR's history. "We have new leadership here. The leadership is Jim France. It's Jim France's vision. It's Jim France's plan. It's Jim France who's going to get people to collaborate and be part of this. It's really about Jim." Jim France mentioned the question of succession when discussing the future of the sport and the leadership potential of his nephew, Ben Kennedy. "This is what we do, and we've got the next generation coming. We plan to keep it in the family." This same progression can be seen in many royal lineages. Should a prince not fulfill his duty as king, his uncle may assume the throne. In fact, NASCAR's leadership has followed the rules of the line succession, similar to that of the British monarchy. The only time Bill Sr. was beholden to others' powers outside of his own company was when an outside company, such as an automaker, wanted him to make changes. Of course, this ultimately still benefited France as these outside companies brought in more revenue. Thus, a begrudging cooperation effort still ultimately served France's own desires and interests. Any competitor or team owner who did not want to follow France's command and lead were told they could leave. These were consistently the policies and procedures across the board under the leadership of Bill France Sr. Once Bill France Jr. took over the leadership role, the company was secured under the family control. Bill Jr. continued to control NASCAR in a firm, matter-of-fact manner as his father had operated the business before him. Although Bill Jr. was willing to listen to team owners, drivers, and others to a small degree, his willingness to do so did not change the established leadership protocol. Bill Jr. made sure to establish himself as the last word on any topic concerning the sport. Brian France's leadership tenure is the most tumultuous of the sport's history. He, like his father and grandfather, led with authority that did not allow for those outside of the family to question his decision-making process. Brian was the first leader who did not participate in building the sport from the ground up. Jim, like those who served in the leadership role before him, has the last word on what takes place in the company. He is in a unique position as he has served as the most trusted advisor to the previous leaders, his nephew Brian and his brother Bill Jr. He also, like his brother, was able to observe his father's leadership firsthand. The changing landscape of sports over the last three-quarters of a century presents NASCAR in a new challenge today. As of November 8, 2024, the judge in the 2311 Front Row Motorsports lawsuit has denied the request for a preliminary injunction because the charter agreement contains a release clause waiving the team's ability to sue NASCAR. NASCAR has stated that it will move on with 32 charters and that 2311 and Front Row Motorsports may sign open car agreements. Through 76 years, thousands of drivers, hundreds of owners, and the millions of other people that have made it all happen, one thing is held true: NASCAR wins.